Hello, my name is Webb Mealy. I'm a Bible scholar and theologian with a PhD in Biblical Studies and a specialty in the Book of Revelation. I've created this presentation to show 5 major models of the Millennium of Revelation 20. You see on the screen there a cross on the left and a kind of sunrise image on the right. The cross stands in the midst of human history. Jesus Christ's coming in glory signals the end of this age and the inauguration of the age of God's fully manifested kingdom on earth. So the flow of time through history in this graphic representation moves from left to right. The sunrise, with Jesus there, symbolizes his coming in glory, which signals the wrapping up of this age and the dawning of the age to come, what Jesus calls that age. With that basic orientation to the graphical scheme, let's look at 5 major models of the Millennium of Revelation 20, which pictures a 1,000-year priestly reign of the resurrected faithful with Christ.
Here's the basic premillennial scheme. We see represented in the red arrow here that history in this age includes the ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and continues up to his coming in glory. The green arrow represents the understanding that Christ's coming in glory signals the beginning of the 1,000-year reign of Christ, prophesied in Revelation 20, verses 1 to 10. After that age, endless ages or all eternity will continue, as represented by the purple arrow. Standard premillennialists put the last judgment of humanity at the end of the 1,000 years, reading Revelation 20, verses 11 to 15, sequentially after Revelation 20, verses 1 to 10. Immediately after the Last Judgment, once again treating the text of Revelation 19 to 21 as a simple chronological movement, standard premillennialists see the new creation described in Revelation 21, verse 1 as coming immediately after the Last Judgment of Revelation 20, verses 11 to 15. This makes understanding the sequence of things relatively simple. If an event is described later in the text, it is assumed to take place later in time. But here's the thing. This simple parallel relationship between text and time cannot be assumed. It has to be determined by studying the literary workings of Revelation. If the assumption of simple temporal correspondence is mistaken, then the model will be incorrect. So that's the basic premillennial structure. Let's now look at an amillennial scheme. As in the premillennial scheme, this age runs from before Christ's incarnation, suffering, and resurrection, and lasts until his coming in glory. Unlike the premillennial scheme, the 1,000-year reign of Revelation 20, verses 1 to 10, is understood by amillennialists to overlap the latter part of the current age, starting at Christ's resurrection and exaltation. They would link it with his enthronement in Revelation 5, and ending at his coming in glory. What amillennialists tend to call the eternal state thus begins at Christ's coming in glory, and the new creation of Revelation 21, verse 1 comes at Christ's coming, and not later. The last judgment of Revelation 20, verses 11 to 15, is taken to be the same event as the judgment that Jesus says will take place at the transition between this age and that age, the age to come. This model has the advantage of bringing Revelation into line with certain New Testament passages, especially John chapter 5, that seem to look ahead to a single resurrection and judgment of all humanity on one occasion. But like premillennialism, it is only valid to the extent that it can be demonstrated to reflect the actual literary structure of Revelation. Now let's turn and look to a postmillennial scheme. We have, as in the previous 2 models, this age lasting until Christ's coming in glory. As in amillennialism, the 1,000-year reign of Revelation 20 is understood to overlap this age, but not the whole age. Traditional postmillennialists imagine that the millennium will at some point gradually dawn as Christian belief and culture rise to universal and global influence, resulting in a kind of golden age, where the devil's influence will be minimal and justice and virtue will be the norm. More recently, partial preterist postmillennialists have suggested that the millennium is already underway, having begun in AD 70. Aside from this difference, Postmillennialism is the same as amillennialism. The new creation, a single general resurrection, and the last judgment all take place when Jesus comes in glory. In all three of these schemes, the last judgment is usually imagined to take place in the gap between the dissolution of this age and world, referred to in Revelation 20, verse 11, and God's establishment of the new creation. Let's now look at an atemporal scheme. This scheme or model is often resorted to by less conservative Revelation scholars and is generally underappreciated by evangelicals. A few have slowly been converted to it, especially Revelation commentator Robert Mounce, although he states his opinion very cautiously. Atemporal interpreters recognize that Revelation clearly puts the beginning of the 1,000-year reign at Christ's coming in glory, Revelation 20, verses 1 to 3, being well linked to Revelation 19, verses 11 to 21. But they theorize that the 1,000 years is symbolic rather than representing an actual period of time. Most often they think it symbolizes that the martyrs, those who gave their lives up in loyalty to Jesus, deserve a special reward. They are imagined to get a whole 1,000-year reign all to themselves, but according to them this is not to be taken literally. Thus, in most respects, their scheme looks like amillennialism, with the new creation and the last judgment ultimately to be understood as coming at Christ's coming in glory. Finally, let's look at new creation millennialism. This is the model of the millennium that I hold in common with the author of the late 1st century Epistle of Barnabas, the Christian Apocalypse of Elijah, Methodius of Olympus, Victorinus, Bishop of Petau, the first recorded commentator on Revelation, John Gill, the most famous 18th century English Bible commentator, and a number of other Bible scholars, including Eckhard Schnabel. As in premillennial and atemporal approaches, new creation millennialism understands that the 1,000 years begin when Jesus comes in glory at the end of this age. After that age, run an endless sequence of ages. The idea of an eternal state, in which nothing ever changes, is not reflected in Revelation or any place else in the Bible. In Greek, Revelation 22 verse 5 says not that the saints will reign forever and ever, but rather for the ages of the ages. There's no picture of abstract eternity in the Bible, just time stretching out indefinitely into the future. There may well be change and development beyond what we think of as the end, but it's just not shown to us. We'll learn about it in God's good time. New creation millennialism recognizes that the great judgment of the living and the dead takes place at Christ's coming in glory. This reading thus creates no tension between Revelation and the teachings of Jesus and the New Testament writers. Similarly, it recognizes the new creation of Revelation 21, verse 1, and the coming of the New Jerusalem, Revelation 21, verse 2, as belonging to Christ's coming in glory and not belonging 1,000 years later. Once again, this makes Revelation align with the teachings of Jesus and Peter in 2 Peter 3. New creation millennialism understands that a secondary and final judgment of the unrepentant takes place after the 1,000 years. Essentially, it's a parole, a re-offense, and a final destruction. Revelation 20, verses 7 to 10 depict the resurrection, deception, and attack of the hordes of Gog, and this is to be read as the same event as Revelation 20, verses 13 to 15, which pictures the resurrection of the unrepentant humanity, their judgment on the basis of their behavior, and their consignment to the pool of fire, the second death. The two scenes, Revelation 20, verses 7 to 10, and Revelation 20, verses 13 to 15, present two viewpoints on the same final judgment of the unrepentant, the one as a battle, as in the Old Testament prophets, and the other as a courtroom scene, as in Daniel 7 and Revelation 11, verses 15 to 18, and 20, verses 4 to 6. Each of these models has oddities or problems that it has to work out. Let's look first at amillennialism. Amillennialism's first problem is that it has to plot the millennium, where the devil is supposedly sitting in chains, locked up and sealed up in the prison of the underworld, Revelation chapter 20, verses 1 to 3, on top of what Paul calls this present evil age, an age in which he and Peter and John in Revelation chapters 12 to 19 see the devil marauding around free, active, hostile, and deadly to Christians. This is a heavy contradiction. The solution they propose is that the 1,000-year reign takes place invisibly in heaven. And they try to minimize, or make paradoxical, the picture of the devil's imprisonment and powerlessness. Along with this, they typically say that the expulsion of the devil and his armies from heaven in Revelation chapter 12 is the same event as the devil's imprisonment in Revelation 20, verses 1 to 3. You almost have to make this identification in order to make the 1,000 years end at Christ's coming in glory, rather than start at Christ's coming in glory. The difficulty with identifying these two scenes is that a careful comparison reveals that they do not match at all. The only thing that's really the same between the two of them is that the devil is a participant, and that is nothing like enough to make the two be the same. A third move, which seems very natural at first, is to identify the Battle of Armageddon, Revelation chapter 19, verses 11 to 21, with the Battle of Gog and Magog, Revelation 20, verses 7 to 10. Both these schemes, after all, allude to the great battle of Ezekiel 38. The problem is that the beast of Revelation 13 doesn't fit into this scheme no matter where you put him. If you say he appears at the end of the 1,000 years, then the martyrs of Revelation 20, verses 4 to 6, whom he beheaded, rise and reign before he ever shows up to kill them. But if you plot the beast's reign on top of the 1,000 years as a whole, then you get a stark contradiction with Revelation 20, verses 1 to 3. The devil is supposed to be chained up in a hole, unable to deceive the nations, not having his best success in all of human history in deceiving the nations to get them to attack and murder the saints. Premillennialism has problems of its own. For example, what is this about ordinary mortals surviving the transition between this age and the age to come to take part in the millennial period? Not only do John the Baptist and Jesus and Peter in 2 Peter 3 say explicitly and unequivocally that none but the faithful will take part in the age to come, but Revelation itself pictures Christ's coming in glory as the complete end of all unrepentant humanity, including the dissolution of the present creation. For example, Revelation 6, verses 12 to 17, and Revelation 19, verses 11 to 21. On the other hand, if, as in New Creation Millennialism, which is also a premillennial scheme, one affirms that only the faithful who are resurrected take part in the age to come, then over what do they reign? The answer I give is that they reign over the living earth, fulfilling humanity's original commission in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 to 28. The apparent exclusivity of the millennium leads to another problem. Where do the hordes of Gog and Magog come from in Revelation 20, verses 7 to 10, if none but the resurrected faithful exist on the earth during the millennium? John gives us a number of clues that Gog and Magog are none other than the rest of the dead, who, as predicted a few seconds previously in 20, verse 5, did not come to life until the 1,000 years were completed. New Creation Millennialism has unique problems and puzzles of its own. Let's have a look at the basic model and refamiliarize ourselves with it for a moment. The millennium, the 1,000-year reign, begins at Christ's coming in glory, as in standard premillennialism, but so does the new creation, as in amillennial, postmillennial, and A-Temporal schemes. This means that the new creation cannot be read in sequence with the Last Judgment scene, which means that we have to employ a recapitulation reading strategy. In other words, we have to be open to the possibility that John is shown multiple visions of Christ's coming in glory, and that Revelation 21, verses 1 to 7 is one of these. Those inclined to read Revelation as a simple forward-marching narrative are not going to be happy with this. On the other hand, an unprejudiced comparison between Revelation 21, verse 2, and Revelation 19, verses 5 to 9, leads strongly to the idea that the wedding of Christ and his bride, that is promised in an audition in chapter 19, is after the judgment-themed interlude of chapter 20 presented in a vision. It makes no sense to imagine that the wedding should be delayed for 1,000 years after Christ's coming in glory. It was my encountering of this single point in a little book by Rudolf Schnackenburg entitled God's Rule and Kingdom that converted me to New Creation Millennialism. New Creation Millennialism, like premillennial schemes generally, has the oddity of the final judgment of humanity being split into two phases or stages, one at Christ's coming in glory, Revelation 20 verses 4 to 5, and one 1,000 years or a whole age later. The first judgment results in a negative verdict for the rest of the dead, and their sentence is to have their resurrection delayed for 1,000 years. In other words, they are sentenced to 1,000 years of incarceration in the prison of Hades, the realm of the dead. But when the rest of the dead are finally raised, when they are released from the prison of Hades, they attempt to do the same sort of thing that got them condemned and incarcerated in the first place. They attack the faithful ones. This is Revelation 20, verses 8 to 10. They are incinerated by fire, indicating their final and irrevocable removal from the creation. But now a further oddity comes to light. We seem to have a doubling of the final fate of the resurrected unrepentant in Revelation 20, verses 13 to 15. Now it's in a courtroom setting. How are these two pictures to be reconciled? The answer is that one and the same judgment can clearly be presented first as a battle scene and then as a courtroom scene. Christ's coming as judge of the living and the dead is presented as a battle in Revelation 19, verses 11 to 21, and then as a courtroom scene in Revelation 20, verse 4. The battle is the trial, and the trial is a battle. There are two viewpoints on one judgment. A look at Daniel 7, parallel to both Revelation 19, verses 11 to 21, and 20, verses 4 to 6, also shows both battle and courtroom imagery in the same scene. A final oddity of New Creation Millennialism is that it has the resurrected wicked, as some people call them, getting to experience the new creation. Uriah Smith, the grandfather of Seventh-day Adventist interpretation of Revelation, rejected John Gill's New Creation Millennialism because Smith said that it was unthinkable God would allow the resuscitated wicked to tread with their unhallowed feet on the holy ground of the new creation. On the other hand, did not God allow the first humans to experience the glory of the pristine first creation, foreknowing that they would turn away from him and give themselves over to the deception of the enemy? New Creation Millennialism reveals the symmetry between the first fall in the first paradise and the last fall in the last paradise. Even the tempter is there doing the very same thing, convincing human beings to rebel against God. But in the last paradise, unlike the first, there is no reprieve from the warning, "When you do this, you shall surely die." Well, that's the end of the presentation. I hope you've enjoyed it. To learn more about New Creation Millennialism, read my latest book, New Creation Millennialism, which is available for about $5 on Amazon.com. I'll put a link in the description below. Also, feel free to visit my website, simplegospel.com, because that gives the overall theology that puts this eschatological model into the largest context. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I'd be glad to see your comments.